As mentioned, I'm a partner in DLA Piper US. I'm based out of our Philadelphia office. I am also the chair of our Technology Transactions, Life Sciences, Licensing, and Collaboration group here in the US. Today, I was going to speak about the Bayh-Dole Act, which is also commonly referred to as the Patent and Trademark Laws Amendments Act. Next slide, please. So the Bayh-Dole Act was a federal law that was enacted by the U.S. Federal government in the 1980s. And the entire point of the Bayh-Dole Act was to create a uniform patent policy for federal agencies funding research. So prior to Bayh-Dole, there was no uniformity with respect to federal funding for research. And depending on the agency that you're contracting with and the terms of that agreement, the terms of the IP were all over the place, but the federal government did retain ownership of any sort of IP that arose from the research. And the Bayh-Dole Act changed that. So part of Bayh-Dole was to create uniformity, but also reliability with respect to federally funded research funding, as well as the IP position of the recipient of that funding moving forward. It is credited with an increase of university tech transfer licensing. So, for instance, in 1981, Bayh-Dole was enacted in 1980. In 1981, there was only 1,635 patents that were credited as federally funded patents. In the US, when you file a patent that had federal funding related to it, you need to, in the patent itself, in the first sentence, provide a statement that says that it's subject to federal funding. So it's a way that the government can track, but it also puts notice on other individuals that it is a Bayh-Dole patent. In 2020, that number rose to 79, almost 8,000 patents that were Bayh-Dole patents. So over the 40 years, you do see an increase of almost 8 times the number of patents from the baseline of 1980 up to 2020 when the numbers were reviewed. A lot of the technology that comes out of Bayh-Dole, it's biotech heavy. The 3 areas: biological research, bio-AI, and bioinformatics. Those tend to be the higher percentage of the patents. That said, it is across all industries. So Bayh-Dole is not only life sciences or only industry, like a specific industry. It's industry agnostic. So universities became very, very active once Bayh-Dole came into play, and we'll go through in the next slide what Bayh-Dole changed. The act ultimately gave the universities the ability to take a more active role in licensing these technologies because they own the technologies and it wasn't subject to the government owning them. And the reason that the act was so instrumental was it was looked at as to speed up the commercialization process of federally funded research. Universities are also quicker and more adept than the U.S. federal government in seeking out commercialization partners. So between 1981 and 2020, 9 of the top 15 recipients of Bayh-Dole patents were universities. So in this presentation, I am focusing on universities, and I keep saying universities. Bayh-Dole isn't limited. I would like to state Bayh-Dole isn't limited to universities. So it's any nonprofit, which includes universities, but also small business is involved as well. So the act actually uses the term contractor as the recipient. But throughout this presentation, I've used university because that's where I practice and that's where I see this act come into play in the technology transfer world. So examples of successful university commercialization of these federally funded technologies is anything from Stanford's Cohen-Boyer patent on the basic gene splicing tools to the Axel patents from Columbia University, which provided a completely new process for inserting genes into mammalian cells to make proteins. So there's very large IP that is coming out of these BIDOL patents and huge commercialization opportunities as well. So let's get into the act. So here's the key provisions of BIDOL. These I tried to break it down into the main provisions and what really drives BIDOL analysis in technology transfer licensing. So the university retains ownership of any invention created as a result of the federal funding. I say the university retains ownership. In the US, the professors are still the inventors. So whoever invented it is the inventor of the patent. They, as part of their employment with the university, will assign that IP to the university as part of the university's patent policy. That said, as between the US federal government and the university retains the ownership of the IP that's developed as a result of the federal funding. And that ownership's important because that puts them in a stronger position when they go to license it out to commercial entities. There's a disclosure requirement to the federal government of the creation of any invention derived from federally funded research. So it's under BIDOL, it's not that you get this, you get a grant of federally funded money, and then the federal government gets a license and you move on. You need to report to the federal government of any invention derived, and there's obligations with respect to filing IP. There's a diligence obligation as well on the university to attempt to develop and commercialize the invention. And so that goes to the creation and this boom of tech transfer offices in the US side with respect to commercialization of the invention. As you all know, universities are not in the business of commercializing. They're there to develop and conduct research. So the tech transfer arms of these universities really are to do BD and to develop relationships with industry to then have industry license to be able to commercialize the invention. So the licensing arm of these tech transfer groups is really important because part of their role is to fill this obligation with respect to any IP that's subject to this federally funded grant. The federal government receives a non-exclusive license to the invention with the right to sublicense under certain circumstances. This is called the Marchand right. We will get more into the Marchand right. This is one that is highly controversial and one that is the subject of a lot of articles and has been in the news recently through the Biden administration. So we'll get through that too. Priority must be given to small businesses to license the invention. That said, even if the priority is supposed to be given to small businesses, you do see a lot of license agreements between universities and very big pharma. And how is that, right? The caveat to this obligation is that the fair market value of the invention needs to be considered. That's part of this prong. And so small businesses may not be able to recognize be able to bring an offer to the university that would recognize the fair market value of the invention. So while this is an obligation, this doesn't hinder, I would say, licenses with big pharma and big biotech with universities with respect to federally funded BIDOL patents. When granting an exclusive license, the university must ensure that the invention will be manufactured substantially in the United States. This is another one that comes up a lot in licensing. And the reason being is because universities require this in their agreements. If it's part of the IP that is subject to the license grant are BIDOL patents, they will include in the provision this substantial manufactured in the United States requirement, which, as everybody knows, we've moved more towards a global world, especially on supply chain side. And having the obligation to manufacture substantially in the United States can be a pretty big burden, especially for some companies whose supply chains may be more global and may not have any manufacturing capabilities in the United States. So this is one where there are exceptions granted to this obligation, and in individual cases, a federal agency can waive it, but you'd need to show that under the circumstances, domestic manufacture is not commercially feasible in the United States. Clients of mine have successfully shown this and received this exception. It is a lot of paperwork and a lot to show, but if you're looking at a potential drug product or therapy in life sciences and your entire supply chain is outside the US, it's not really commercially feasible to then require a portion of that supply chain to come back into the US to be manufactured just to be in compliance with BIDOL. So this is one where you will see an exception. Excess revenue must support research and education. So any revenue that comes in from the licensing of BIDOL patents, that excess revenue must support research and education. The statute does provide specific numbers with respect to percentages of overall budget, etc. This isn't one that is very controversial because revenue tends to, within universities, go towards the research and education. So this isn't something that tends to be an issue. And then last, the university must share a portion of the royalties with the inventors. This is one where the inventors under BIDOL must receive a portion of the royalties, but it doesn't specify how much of that portion is. It is pretty typical in US universities that there is an IP policy. As part of that IP policy, it's not just limited to BIDOL patents that receive that inventors would receive a portion of the royalties. It tends to be across any IP that's developed with respect to that inventor, that if the university is successful in licensing it out and receives financial compensation from a commercial third party with respect to that technology transaction, then a portion of that amount goes to the inventor. This codified that, and it is more of an issue with respect to, the small businesses, not necessarily the universities that can receive federally funding. At the beginning of this presentation, I had mentioned that I'm focusing on universities, but other contractors such as small businesses can receive federal funding for research and development, and they would then have to give a portion of the royalties to the inventor in the private sector, and that is something that is not necessarily common. So next slide, please. So march-in rights under the Act. So march-in rights is something that is brought up a lot. I would say that in the almost 44 years that this act has been in place, they've never successfully been achieved. There's been 8 instances where companies have tried to bring march-in rights and enforce the government to use its march-in rights under the act, and none of them have been successfully achieved. They've normally been in drug cases where pharmaceutical products in the United States, the prices have been astronomical, and it's companies that are trying to open up competition with respect to drug pricing and have tried to use BIDOL as a reasoning for doing that. So a march-in right is not that you take away the license to the commercial entity that the university has granted that exclusive license to. But what it does do is it would give a third party a non-exclusive license to that same IP. And it would do it under one of these 4 provisions. So the 4 provisions are: the university has not taken or isn't expected to take within a reasonable period of time effective steps to achieve practical application of the subject invention in such field. So basically, this is a diligence requirement. If the university hasn't achieved their diligence obligations with respect to that patent then this is a reason to allow, right, the government to come in and have another third party do it. Health or safety needs are not reasonably satisfied by the university assignee or their licensees. So this goes to, a public health or safety concern as a whole. That said, Bidol it wasn't used with COVID, right? So if there was any Bidol patents, we didn't see any sort of actions where somebody tried to force their marching rights for that, but that would be a scenario, right, that would fall under health or safety needs. Requirements for public use specified by federal regulations are not reasonably satisfied. So this is another diligence-like requirement with respect to public use and making it available to the public. And then the last is the subject invention will not be manufactured in the United States. And again, as we discussed on the last slide, that is one that you can get an exception for. So it's typically not brought up under that. The marching right arguments tend to be brought up under B, where it's a health or safety need, are not reasonably satisfied, or C, requirements of public use. So in these drug pricing cases where they've tried to bring in the arguments that marching rights are necessary because the public use of that drug isn't being reasonably satisfied because the pricing's too high. So the marching rights have also been in the news recently here in the United States because the Biden administration did propose a new framework on December 7th, 2023, with respect to the marching rights. Part of that new framework, if enacted, that proposal would encourage the use of marching rights on the basis of price. For instance, these drug cases where the prices are too high. That's exactly what the Biden administration is supporting. Universities have been adverse to this. Many university tech transfer offices, former university officials, et cetera, have warned against the dangerous use of marching rights as really coming against what Bidol stands for, and it would go against, these healthy university tech transfer offices and commercialization. The FTC, however, the Federal Trade Commission in the United States, is supportive of a more use of marching rights. So they've been coming at it the other way and have provided supportive documentation and comments. So that is something we expect to see coming up in the next couple months, that we will see more on marching rights in the news, and also as this framework makes its way through. Can I go to the next slide, please? Okay, last, I thought it would be helpful for the group to see what a sample retained rights provision would be in a university license. So in the United States, in the university licenses where you'd have an exclusive license, there is a Bidol patent. This is a very common provision that you would see in that license agreement. And it basically says that the license is subject to the license of the U.S. government executed by the licensor. So it's subject to any provisions of that license, any overriding obligations of the U.S. government under 35 USC sections 200 to 212. That's Bidol. That's a reference to Bidol, as well as the U.S. government sponsored research agreement or other guidelines. So even though Bidol is a federal statute, there also is an agreement with the university and the federal government, say NIH, who's provided the federal funding that sets forth all the provisions that are in Bidol are in that agreement. And there's also other requirements that they'll include in there with respect to reporting and other requirements with respect to the IP. So it's subject to that agreement as well. Last, it talks about any products that result from the IP that are sold in the U.S. would need to be substantially manufactured in the U.S. That's the substantial manufacturer obligation. And again, that's something, this is the only part of this provision that we tend to see modified at all. And that is if the licensee requests a waiver or an exception from the federal government for that obligation, sometimes they will request that the licensor will aid them or assist them in receiving that waiver. Okay, so that is vital in a nutshell. I know that I went through a lot of provisions and content in a quick period of time, but I hope you were able to learn some of our processes over here. Thank you.